Down below the cliff face, in the churned mud and relative sanity of the 77th Infantry Division's command post, the official explanation was already being written. Not on paper, not yet, but in the grim, exhausted minds of the officers who had just watched their grand assault collapse into a bloody rout. Captain Jack Glover, commander of B Company, stared at the map tacked to an ammunition crate, but he wasn't seeing the topographical lines. He was seeing the ghosts of his men, silhouettes tumbling from that flat, cursed plateau 100 meters above his head. The plan, as all military plans are in the beginning, had been a thing of cold, clean logic. Take the ridge. Secure the escarpment. Punch a hole in the Shuri line. It was geometry, pure and simple. But the Japanese defenders had answered their geometry with a furious, brutal arithmetic of machine guns, mortars, and interlocking fields of fire. The plan didn't just fail, it was dismembered. The order to retreat had been given, and the survivors had scrambled back down the cargo nets, leaving the dead and the dying where they lay. The battle for Hacksaw Ridge was, for all intents and purposes, over for the day. A catastrophic failure. Then the first report came in. It was garbled, relayed by a wide-eyed private who had been one of the last men off the net. "Sir," he'd stammered to a sergeant, I think Doss is still up there." The name registered with Captain Glover instantly. Private Desmond Doss. The medic. The conscientious objector. The quiet, infuriatingly stubborn Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia who had driven his drill sergeants mad by refusing to so much as touch a rifle. Glover had tried to have him transferred, tried to get him sectioned 8 as mentally unfit. To him, a soldier who wouldn't fight was a liability, a weakness in the chain. The man was a problem to be managed, not a soldier to be counted on. Now, in any sane military playbook, there's a neat and tragic box for this situation. A soldier, overwhelmed by the horror of his first real taste of combat, refuses a direct order to retreat. He stays behind, wandering the battlefield in a daze. The diagnosis is simple, clinical, and immediate combat fatigue. Shell shock. The man has broken. He is no longer an asset, he is another casualty, just one whose heart is still beating. Glover's initial, internal assessment was exactly that. "He's cracked," he muttered to his radio man. "Another good man lost to the goddamn war." The official story was forming Private Doss, a soldier of questionable stability to begin with, had suffered a psychotic break atop the ridge and was now presumed missing, likely killed. It was tragic, but it fit the known universe of war. Then the contradiction arrived. It didn't come over a radio or in a runner's message. It came on a rope. A lookout near the base of the escarpment yelled, a cry of disbelief that cut through the groans of the wounded. Men looked up. Dangling from the cliff edge, a single, impossibly thin rope was being lowered. And tied to the end of it, cradled in a makeshift sling, was a wounded GI. The rope reached the bottom, and the man was gently deposited on the ground. Medics rushed forward. Before anyone could fully process what they were seeing, the rope was pulled back up and disappeared over the edge. 5 minutes later, it happened again. Another man, this one with his leg mangled, lowered with the same steady, deliberate care. Then another, and another. An impossible conveyor belt of life, delivering men from a place the official story had already declared a tomb. Imagine you're an accountant, and you've just closed the books on a catastrophic loss. The ledger is filled with red ink. Your assets are gone, written off. Then, someone walks in and starts placing gold bars on your desk, one by one. You ask where they came from. And the answer is, they're from the vault you just declared empty and sealed shut. It doesn't compute. It violates the fundamental rules of your reality. Captain Glover stormed out of his tent and saw it for himself. A line of a dozen wounded men he had personally written off for dead, now lying on stretchers at the base of the cliff. He knelt beside one, a corporal from his own company whose chest was a mess of bloody bandages. "Who did this?" Glover demanded, his voice rough with shock. "Who got you down?" The corporal's eyes fluttered open. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Doss," he whispered, the name a puff of air. "The medic, he's pulling us out." The official explanation, the easy, tragic story of a soldier's mind breaking shattered against the brutal, bloody evidence of a dozen living men. The official explanation, the easy, tragic story of a soldier's mind breaking shattered against the brutal, bloody evidence of a dozen living men. Glover stood up, his mind reeling. A man suffering from shell shock doesn't have the presence of mind to find the wounded. A man who is cracked doesn't have the skill to tie a bullet on a bite, not a knot designed not to slip or tighten under load around a soldier's chest and lower him 100 meters to safety. Not once, and certainly not 12 times. The story wasn't right. It wasn't just wrong, it was the polar opposite of the truth. Glover looked from the line of saved men back up to the smoke-shrouded lip of the ridge, the place he had abandoned. The problem soldier he had dismissed as a liability was still up there. And he wasn't broken. He was working. To understand the sheer, terrifying insanity of what was happening on that cliff face, you have to pull back from the individual men and see the battlefield the way a general does as a map. A map of unforgiving terrain, enemy strongpoints, and strategic objectives. War, from that height, is a brutal form of physics. You apply force here to create a weakness there. And on the map of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the Maeda escarpment, the jagged cliff the soldiers had nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge, was the single most important point of leverage on the entire island. Let's use an analogy, a bit of a war college briefing. Imagine the Japanese defense of southern Okinawa is an ancient, impregnable castle door. It's made of iron-hard oak, reinforced with steel. You can pound on it with artillery, you can burn it with flamethrowers, but the door holds. This door is the Shuri line, a chain of interlocking fortifications, caves, and bunkers that stretched across the island. For weeks, the American advance had been stalled, bleeding out against this line. Now Hacksaw Ridge. Hacksaw wasn't just another part of the door. It was the lock. It was the high ground that commanded the approaches to the entire eastern flank of the Shuri defenses. If you could take the ridge, you could pry open the lock. And if you could open the lock, the entire door would eventually swing open. The whole campaign, the lives of tens of thousands of men, hinged on seizing that one plateau. The 77th Infantry Division had just thrown its best men at that lock. And the lock had not only held it, had chewed them up and spit them back out. The official military assessment was clear and bleak. The position was, for now, impregnable. The enemy's fire was too concentrated, their defenses too well prepared. The plan was to regroup, to call in naval bombardments, to try again in a day, maybe two. The ridge had been ceded back to the Japanese. This is what makes what Doss was doing so strategically significant. He wasn't just saving lives. He was, in his own quiet way, refusing to cede the ground. Every man he lowered down that cliff was a piece of the American army that was not captured, not killed, not left behind enemy lines. He was single-handedly mitigating the cost of a catastrophic defeat. But there was a far more immediate and terrifying stake. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon. And on Okinawa, the night belonged to the Imperial Japanese Army. They were masters of infiltration, of silent, terrifying counterattacks that materialized out of the darkness. They knew the Americans had been repulsed. They knew the top of the ridge would be littered with American wounded and dead. It was standard Japanese doctrine to sweep the battlefield after a failed assault, to finish off the wounded, to strip the bodies of intelligence and supplies. A lone man, armed or not, wandering that plateau after dark wasn't just a man in danger. He was a dead man. The men he was trying to save were dead men. The clock wasn't just ticking on their wounds, it was ticking on the inevitable, merciless tide of the Japanese counterattack that would wash over the ridge as soon as darkness provided cover. Back at the base of the cliff, this horrifying calculus began to dawn on Captain Glover and the other officers. What had started as a strange anomaly, a ghost lowering men from the sky, was transforming into a new, undeclared tactical situation. They had an American asset, a highly effective one-man rescue operation, taking place on a piece of real estate they had officially surrendered. He was holding a position they couldn't take, armed with nothing but morphine syrettes and rolls of gauze. The Army's plan had collapsed. The rulebook was out the window. Now, there was only one reality that mattered, the one being created by an unarmed medic and a length of rope. They couldn't shell the top of the ridge for fear of hitting him. They couldn't just leave him to his fate. To do so would be to condemn not only Doss, but every single man he was fighting to save. The official, orderly retreat was over. A new, desperate, and utterly insane mission was being born in the twilight, a mission with no orders from high command and no precedent in any field manual. They had to support him. But how do you support a ghost? How do you reinforce a man who won't carry a gun, on a battlefield you've already abandoned, against an enemy you cannot see. Down at the base of the cliff, the raw, chaotic shock began to cool and harden into a kind of focused, desperate purpose. The men of the 77th were no longer just watching a miracle, they were participating in one. A field hospital of sorts had sprung up, medics working furiously on the men being delivered from the sky. Every time the rope reappeared over the lip of the escarpment, a hushed reverence fell over the soldiers. They watched it descend, a thin umbilical cord connecting the world of the living to the world of the dead, bearing another soul back from the brink. The initial investigation had answered the question of who was up there. But now, a far more critical investigation had begun. What was the situation on the ground, and how, in God's name, was he doing it? Captain Glover became the lead detective in this grim affair. He stood with his field glasses trained on the cliff's edge, not moving, barely breathing. He was trying to read the battlefield through the actions of one man. The wounded were in no condition to give detailed reports. Their stories were feverish fragments of explosions, screams, and then the quiet, calming voice of the medic from Virginia. The only reliable intelligence was Doss himself, and he wasn't talking. But his actions were starting to speak volumes. At first, it seemed random. A body would appear, be lowered, and the rope would vanish. But after the 15th man, then the 16th, Glover and a grizzled platoon sergeant beside him saw it. A pattern, a faint, but unmistakable clue in the madness. "Sir," the sergeant said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "Look there. The rope. It's coming from the same spot every time. Give or take a few feet." Glover adjusted his focus, his knuckles white on the binoculars. The sergeant was right. Along the 100-yard expanse of the cliff edge, scarred with shell craters and scrubby vegetation, the rope was always appearing from behind one specific, gnarled tree stump that jutted out from the plateau like a broken tooth. Doss wasn't just dragging men to the nearest edge and heaving them over. He had established a base of operations, a casualty collection point, a tiny, sacred island of relative safety in an ocean of machine gun fire. This was the first real breakthrough, the first piece of hard data from the other side. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to guide a rescue mission into a collapsed mine. It's pitch black, the radios are dead, and you have no map of the tunnels. All you know is that it's a labyrinth of death. Then, from one single air vent, you start to feel a faint tapping, a rhythmic signal. You still don't know how many survivors there are or what dangers they face, but for the first time, you have a fixed point, a location, a place to focus all your efforts. That gnarled tree stump was their air vent. This single clue changed everything. It transformed the American soldiers from helpless spectators into an active support element. They were no longer blind. They had a target, or rather, a target to protect. "Get me the mortar crews," Glover barked, his voice electric with newfound hope. "And every 30 cal we've got. I want a firing solution for a 50-yard perimeter around that stump. North, east, and west of it. We're going to build him a wall of steel." The plan was simple, audacious, and profoundly dangerous. They would lay down intermittent, suppressive fire on the areas flanking Doss's position. They wouldn't fire continuously, that would give away the game. But a burst here, a mortar round there, just enough to convince any Japanese patrols that the area was still being actively contested. Enough to make them keep their heads down. Enough, they prayed, to give Doss the precious seconds he needed to drag another man to that stump, tie his special knot, and send him on his way down. The wall of steel that Captain Glover had ordered was a beautiful idea, born of desperation and a sudden, fierce protectiveness for the medic he had once scorned. On a training ground, it would have been a textbook application of suppressive fire, a neat, geometric solution to a tactical problem. But Hacksaw Ridge wasn't a training ground. It was a thinking, breathing, and profoundly cunning killing field. And the promising lead, the idea that they could shield Doss with a curtain of controlled fire, was about to slam headfirst into the enemy's genius. As darkness began to bleed into the sky, the Japanese commander in the caves honeycombing the escarpment wasn't idle. He was an investigator, too. For him, the anomaly wasn't the single soldier still on the ridge, but the strange, sporadic fire now peppering the plateau. It wasn't a full-scale assault. The Americans had already tried that and failed. It wasn't a blind, harassing fire. It was too patterned for that. It was focused, localized. It was a fire designed to protect something. Imagine playing a game of Battleship. You're firing random shots into the grid, hoping for a hit. Then, your opponent starts concentrating all their return fire in a tight little box around square C4. You haven't hit their ship yet, but their reaction has just told you exactly where it is. Glover's protective fire, intended to be a shield, had inadvertently painted a giant bullseye right over Doss's position. The hunter had just revealed the location of his prize to the other hunter in the forest. The Japanese response was not immediate. They were patient. They were masters of the terrain. They didn't reply with a frontal assault. They replied with something far more insidious, a single, perfectly placed Nambu light machine gun. A runner, his face pale in the gloom, scrambled to Glover's side. "Sir, we've got a problem. Corporal Miller, the one Doss just sent down, he was conscious. He said there's a Nambu. A machine gun, sir. Dug in a spider hole not 30 yards from the stump." The news landed like a grenade in the command post. A spider hole. A one-man fighting position, dug deep into the earth, covered with a lid of camouflaged dirt and grass, virtually invisible until the moment it opens and spits fire. The Japanese soldier inside would have spent the last hour listening, watching, triangulating the source of the American activity. He would have heard the dragging sounds, maybe even caught a glimpse of Doss's silhouette against the dying light. He would have held his fire, with iron discipline, waiting for the perfect moment. The single greatest threat to Doss wasn't a bonsai charge or an artillery barrage. It was this one patient, intelligent, and lethal rifleman lying in wait. Suddenly, the entire dynamic of the battle on the ridge flipped. Doss was no longer a rescuer moving through a static field of leftover dangers. He was a mouse, trapped in a room with a cat that was now wide awake and watching his every move. Glover's wall of steel was useless. Mortars were too inaccurate to hit a target that small. Their own machine guns couldn't get the angle to suppress a deeply entrenched position on top of the ridge. They were completely, utterly helpless to intervene. The promising lead, the hope that had surged through the company, evaporated into cold, sickening dread. They weren't his guardians anymore. They were his pallbearers, waiting for the inevitable. The flow of wounded men stopped. For 10 minutes, the rope didn't appear. Then 20. The silence from the top of the ridge was more terrifying than any explosion. Every man at the bottom of the cliff stared up at the dark line of the escarpment, imagining the scene playing out. The medic, crawling on his belly toward the next wounded man. The soft rustle of grass. The click of a spider hole lid being pushed aside. The single, final burst of a Nambu machine gun. The simple, heroic story of a one-man rescue operation had just collapsed. This was no longer a rescue. It was a duel, and one of the participants didn't even have a weapon. The investigation had hit a dead end, a wall of enemy brilliance and their own tactical impotence. They were no longer the hunters, trying to solve the mystery of Hacksaw Ridge. They were the bait, and it seemed the trap had finally been sprung. The silence from the clifftop stretched into an eternity, thick and suffocating. 20 minutes felt like 20 years. In the command post, the mood turned funereal. The officers had moved from tactical problem-solving to damage control. The consensus was grim. Doss was gone. The miraculous flow of life had been cut off at the source by the cold logic of a single, well-placed machine gun. The only question left was whether to risk a patrol at dawn to recover his body. The investigation, for all intents and purposes, was over. The ridge had finally claimed him. But war is a universe of exceptions. Just when the rules of combat seem absolute, a variable appears that nobody, not the generals with their maps, not the tacticians with their doctrines, could have possibly anticipated. In this case, the breakthrough didn't come from a new piece of technology or a clever flanking maneuver. It came from a detail buried deep in the enemy's own psyche, a psychological blind spot that no American strategist could have predicted or exploited. For the Japanese soldier in that spider hole, the world was a simple, brutal binary. There were fighters, and there were non-fighters. He was a professional, a predator, and his entire being was focused on identifying and destroying the enemy soldiers who had tried to take his sacred ground. He had seen the American helmets, the rifles, the grenades. They were the enemy. Desmond Doss was not that. He didn't move like a soldier. He didn't carry a rifle. He crawled. He administered aid. He whispered prayers. The only logical deduction, The only theory that fits the impossible evidence of what happened next is that to the Nambu gunner watching through a narrow slit in the dirt, Doss's actions didn't register as a military operation. They registered as something other. In the rigid, martial worldview of that Japanese gunner, an unarmed man tending to the wounded wasn't a threat. He wasn't even really a soldier. He was a non-combatant, as clearly marked by his actions as if he wore a giant red cross on his back. In a strange, almost unbelievable twist of wartime logic, the only compelling explanation is that the gunner simply chose not to shoot him. This wasn't a fact the Americans could ever know. Down below, they were still trapped in their own despair. But then it happened. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable: the enemy's own artillery. Suddenly, the sky erupted. A salvo of Japanese mortar shells, intended for the American positions at the base of the cliff, fell short. They rained down all across the top of the ridge in a series of deafening, earth-shattering explosions. It was a miscalculation, a simple gunnery error. But for the men of the 77th, it was a death sentence for anyone still alive up there. A storm of indiscriminate friendly fire was now scourging the plateau. Glover swore, turning away from the cliff face in disgust and grief. That's it. Then, he said to no one in particular, "God damn it all. That's it." If the Nambu gunner hadn't gotten Doss, their own barrage certainly had. But then a private, a kid with binoculars glued to his eyes, screamed, "I see it. I see the rope. Impossible. No one could survive that." Glover snapped his own glasses back up to the ridge. Through the swirling clouds of smoke and dust from the mortar impacts, he saw it. A thin, dark line, swaying against the gray chaos. And then, a body, being lowered with the same maddening, impossible calm as before. The mortar barrage had done what the American intelligence could not. It had revealed the flaw in the enemy's seemingly perfect defense. The Japanese Nambu gunner, so patient and disciplined, was just as vulnerable to his own army's mistakes as anyone else. The explosions had forced him to keep his head down, to abandon his patient vigil. It created a window, a brief, terrifying, smoke-filled window of opportunity. This was the new path forward, not through their own firepower, but through the enemy's. It was a horrifying, desperate gamble. They couldn't protect Doss, but they could use the chaos of the battlefield itself as his shield. The battlefield had become an ecosystem, and Doss was the one creature who had learned to survive in it, using the very storms that should have killed him as cover. The realization was a jolt of pure adrenaline. The investigation wasn't over. They had just been handed a new, infinitely more dangerous set of clues. The question was no longer if he could survive, but how he was surviving. The legend of the conscientious objector was being forged right before their eyes, not in defiance of the violence, but in the very heart of it. A new, more dangerous phase of the mission was about to begin, guided by the rhythm of the enemy's own bombardment. The revelation that Doss was using the enemy's own mortar fire as his shield was a tactical lightning bolt. It was insane, it was suicidal, but it was working. Down below, the men of the 77th began to operate on a new, grim rhythm. They stopped trying to provide their own suppressive fire that had proven to be a liability. Instead, they became obsessive observers, their entire focus narrowed to a single purpose: tracking the cadence of the Japanese bombardments. They became weathermen, forecasting storms of high explosives. When the enemy shells screamed in and the clifftop erupted in fire and smoke, they no longer flinched in fear for Doss. They leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting, praying that he was using that chaos to his advantage. And in the brief, trembling silence that followed each barrage, they would see their prayers answered. The rope would appear. Another man, plucked from the jaws of a man-made hell, would begin his slow descent. The number of rescued men climbed past 30, then 40, then 50. The pile of empty plasma bottles and blood-soaked bandages at the aid station grew into a small mountain, a monument to the work being done 100 meters above their heads. But as the night wore on, and the trickle of survivors continued, a new and deeply uncomfortable truth began to dawn on Captain Glover. He was piecing it together from the fragmented reports of the more lucid of the wounded. They spoke of Doss appearing out of the smoke like an angel, of him dragging them through mud and crawling over the bodies of their friends. And they all said the same thing, over and over, with a kind of awestruck horror. He wasn't just saving the men who were easy to reach. He was going everywhere. Let's go back to our map. The American battle plan had called for a broad, frontal assault across the entire width of the plateau. When the attack was shattered, men fell all over that blasted landscape. Some were near the cliff edge. Many were not. Many were pinned down deep in the interior, closer to the Japanese bunker complexes than to the American lines. They were the ones considered irretrievable, the ones written off not just as casualties, but as lost behind enemy lines. The accepted military logic was to save who you could, cut your losses, and retreat. You don't risk a dozen healthy men to save one wounded soldier who is already surrounded. That is the brutal, but necessary, calculus of command. Desmond Doss did not operate by that calculus. The uncomfortable truth that settled in Glover's stomach was this: Doss wasn't just clearing the wounded from a relatively safe zone near the cliff edge. He was making deep, methodical sweeps across the entire plateau. He was crawling into the very teeth of the Japanese defenses, into the killing zones that had broken the back of an entire rifle company, to find his men. He was operating under the noses of the Nambu gunner and a dozen other enemy positions. This fact was more than just heroic, it was strategically problematic. It completely contradicted the official narrative that was already being drafted for the after-action report. That report would speak of a failed assault and an orderly withdrawal of surviving forces. It would list the men left on the ridge as killed in action. But Doss's one-man operation was proving that dozens of those men weren't dead when the retreat was called. They were wounded, alive, and savable. Imagine you're a fire chief who has ordered his firefighters out of a collapsing building, declaring it a total loss. It's the right call, you followed procedure to save the lives of your crew. Then you discover that a single, unarmed paramedic has been running back into that burning, collapsing structure all night, pulling out survivor after survivor from rooms you had declared empty. His heroism doesn't just save lives, it implicitly raises a terrible question about your own command decision. Could more have been done? Were men abandoned who could have been saved? Doss's actions, in their quiet, profound way, were a silent indictment of the Army's brutal but necessary trade-off. He was demonstrating a different kind of war, one where no man was expendable, where the mission wasn't over until the last living soul was accounted for. This wasn't a truth that high command would be comfortable hearing. It complicated the clean, simple story of a tactical failure. It suggested a moral failure, a failure of nerve, a failure of faith. The medic they had once tried to kick out of the Army was now single-handedly rewriting the definition of duty, and his truth was a deeply uncomfortable one for the men who had left him behind. As dawn approached, casting a sickly gray light over the carnage of Okinawa, the sheer, staggering scale of Doss's accomplishment could no longer be ignored. The base of Hacksaw Ridge looked less like a military position and more like the aftermath of a biblical event. Stretcher-bearers moved with a quiet, reverent urgency, ferrying the wounded men who had been ghosts just hours before to the waiting ambulances. The official count, tallied by a stunned battalion clerk, was 75. 75 men, lowered one by one, from an impregnable fortress of death by a single, unarmed soldier. The myth was now a statistic, an undeniable fact that had to be radioed up the chain of command. The initial report from Captain Glover was concise, factual, and utterly explosive. It detailed the failed assault, the subsequent retreat, and then the actions of Private Desmond T. Doss. It was a report that broke every established mold. In the sterile, acronym-filled language of military communication, it described a miracle. And the system, as systems do, pushed back. The first response from regimental headquarters wasn't a commendation. It was a query, a sharp, skeptical demand for clarification. The transmission, filtered through the hiss of the radio, was dripping with bureaucratic disbelief. 77th Command, be advised, your casualty estimates are anomalous. Please reconfirm number of WIA recovered from Maeda escarpment. Did you say 75? Over. Imagine a corporate accountant in a skyscraper in New York being told by a frantic field agent that a single, unauthorized employee has just single-handedly tripled the quarterly profits using a method not found in any company manual. The first reaction isn't celebration. It's suspicion. It's an audit. The numbers don't make sense. The story violates the known laws of the universe. It must be a mistake. Glover, exhausted and emotionally raw, took the handset himself. "Regiment, this is B Company Actual," he snapped, his voice hoarse. "The number is 75. That is not an estimate. That is a body count. A living body count. All recovered by one man. Private Doss. Over." The silence on the other end of the line was a palpable thing. When the reply came, the tone had shifted from disbelief to clinical concern. "Roger, B Company. Stand by." The implication was clear. A captain on the front lines, having just seen his company decimated, was now filing fantastical reports. He was suffering from combat fatigue. The stress of command had finally cracked him. The official explanation for Doss's actions had failed, so now the system was trying to apply the same diagnosis to the man reporting them. A few minutes later, the call came back down. The order was direct and unequivocal. Glover was to submit a formal, written after-action report immediately. He was to cease all unorthodox support operations. And this was the real sting. A lieutenant from the Inspector General's office was being dispatched to his position to verify his claims and assess the command climate of his unit. They weren't sending a medal. They were sending an investigator. The system wasn't just pushing back, it was actively trying to crush the story. The narrative of an army that makes hard but necessary choices, that retreats to fight another day, is a cornerstone of military doctrine. The narrative of a lone, faith-driven medic exposing that choice as potentially premature or worse, cowardly, was a virus in the machine. It was a story that could not be allowed to stand without being scrubbed, sanitized, and vetted into submission. Glover was being told, in no uncertain terms, to get his story straight, to fit it back into the neat, acceptable boxes of military reporting. He was being ordered to stop his ad hoc investigation into a miracle and prepare for an official investigation into his own sanity. This was the lowest point. It wasn't in the heat of the failed assault, amidst the screaming and the chaos. It was here, in the cold, gray dawn, facing a wall of institutional skepticism. Captain Glover stood beside the command tent, the radio handset still feeling heavy in his palm, and felt a profound sense of exhaustion that went bone deep. He had just witnessed the single greatest act of courage he had ever seen or could ever imagine. And his reward, from the very army he served, was to be treated like a lunatic. The conflict was no longer against the Japanese dug into the ridge, it was against the starched collar reality of his own high command. The order to cease unorthodox operations was a bureaucratic dagger. The sporadic, desperate mortar fire they'd been using to give Doss cover was silenced. The machine gunners who had been watching the ridge with the fierce focus of guardian angels were told to stand down. The entire, fragile ecosystem of support they had built around their lone medic was dismantled by a single radio call from a man sitting safely 5 miles away. They were, once again, helpless spectators. Worse, the impending arrival of the IG officer cast a pall of suspicion over the whole company. Men who had spent the night hauling their resurrected comrades to safety now muttered in angry, hushed tones. Their captain, their leader, was being second-guessed. Their miracle was being audited. The profound, almost religious experience of the last 12 hours was about to be dissected by a cold, clinical bureaucracy that had no language for what had happened here. And then, the rope appeared one last time. It snaked over the edge of the cliff, slower this time, almost hesitant. There was no wounded soldier tied to the end. It was just the rope itself, coiling on the ground. A moment later, a figure began to descend, hand over hand. It was Doss. He reached the bottom, his legs buckling as his feet touched the ground. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a scarecrow made of mud, blood, and bone weariness. His uniform was shredded, stained dark with the blood of other men. His face was a pale mask of exhaustion, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at something none of them could see. Medics rushed to him, but he waved them off, stumbling toward Glover. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, swaying slightly, looking at his captain. In that moment, Glover saw the truth of the last 12 hours etched into the man's face. He saw the horror, the faith, the impossible endurance. He saw a man who had walked through hell and returned, not with stories of fire and brimstone, but with the souls of the damned. It's all of them, sir, Doss whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I think I got them all. He had been on that ridge for nearly 12 hours, under constant fire, without food, water, or a weapon, and his first thought was not of his own survival, but of the completion of his self-appointed mission. Before Glover could even reply, Doss's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed into the arms of the waiting medics. This was the ultimate price of truth. Doss was physically and emotionally shattered. Glover was on the verge of being professionally crucified. The system, in its infinite wisdom, had chosen this exact moment to question the reality of their sacrifice. High Command had audited the miracle and found it wanting. The result was not a change in strategy, but a repeat of the tragedy. For as Doss was being carried away on a stretcher, a runner sprinted up to Captain Glover, his face ashen. He handed over a teletype flimsy. It was the operational order for the next day. The objective had not changed. The disaster they had just barely survived, the catastrophe that had necessitated Doss's impossible heroism, was now irrevocably set in motion to happen all over again. The morning of May 5, 1945, broke with a cruel, indifferent beauty over Okinawa. For the men of B Company, huddled at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, it felt like a cosmic joke. They were being asked to do the impossible all over again. The order stood, take the ridge. But the atmosphere was profoundly, fundamentally different from the day before. The bravado was gone, replaced by a grim, hollow-eyed resolve. They weren't just attacking a fortified Japanese position anymore. They were treading on sacred ground, a place where a miracle had occurred. The very dirt they were about to fight and die on had been consecrated by the blood, sweat, and prayers of the unarmed medic who had shamed them all with his courage. Desmond Doss was not with them. He was miles away in a field hospital, recovering from severe exhaustion and dehydration. But his presence was everywhere. It was in the hushed conversations between veterans, the wide-eyed reverence of the new replacements. Before the first assault, Doss had been an oddity, a religious crank. Now, he was their talisman. He was the shepherd of Hacksaw Ridge. As the men of the 77th prepared for the assault, a strange and unprecedented event took place. It wasn't an order from command, it was a spontaneous, bottom-up movement from the soldiers themselves. A platoon sergeant approached Captain Glover, his helmet in his hands, his expression a mixture of desperation and awe. "Sir," he said, his voice low, "the men won't go. Not without him." It wasn't a mutiny. It was a statement of faith. Glover, who just 2 days ago had tried to get Doss kicked out of the army, now found himself in the bizarre position of being unable to launch an attack because his men believed they were divinely unprotected without the conscientious objector. The irony was so thick he could taste it. The IG officer, who had arrived just an hour before, stood nearby, his notepad out, his face a perfect mask of bureaucratic bewilderment, watching the entire command structure of a frontline rifle company grind to a halt over a missing medic. Glover knew what he had to do. He got on the radio, not to regiment, but to the field hospital. He wasn't requesting a soldier, he was requesting a blessing. A jeep was dispatched, and as the men of B Company waited, the minutes ticking down to H hour, it returned. In the passenger seat, looking pale but resolute, was Private Desmond Doss. He couldn't fight. He could barely stand. But he was there. He walked to the base of the cargo nets, his Bible in his hand, and he knelt in the mud. The entire company, from the captain down to the lowest private, fell silent. They watched as the man who wouldn't touch a weapon prayed for the men who were about to charge into a maelstrom of machine gun fire. This is the unfolding catastrophe, told from the perspective of the ignored warning. The warning wasn't just that the ridge was deadly, it was that the old way of war of pure, brute force was insufficient. Doss's heroism had revealed a different kind of power. And now, the army, in its own clumsy, desperate way, was acknowledging it. The attack on Hacksaw Ridge was no longer just a tactical maneuver. It had become a holy war. When Doss finished praying, he looked up at Glover. "I'm ready, sir." He wasn't going to the aid station. He was going back up. The whistle blew. And for the second time, the men of the 77th swarmed up the cargo nets. But this time, they climbed with a terrifying, almost joyful fury. They weren't just fighting for a piece of rock. They were fighting alongside a living legend, a man who had proven that faith was a weapon more powerful than steel. The tragic, avoidable losses of the first day the 75 men left for dead now served as the fuel for an unstoppable fire. The army had ignored the lesson Doss had taught them with his actions, but the men on the ground had not. and they were about to unleash a storm of righteous vengeance upon the defenders of Hacksaw Ridge. The battle that followed was not a clean, tactical victory. It was an exorcism. The Americans swarmed over the top of the ridge with a ferocity that stunned the Japanese defenders. They fought with a blend of rage and reverence, clearing the spider holes and machine gun nests that had decimated them just a day before. And through it all, Desmond Doss was there, moving through the maelstrom. He wasn't just a medic anymore, he was a mobile shrine, a confirmation that they were not alone. But his charmed life was not infinite. Late in the day, a grenade blast shredded his legs, and as he waited for aid, a sniper's bullet shattered his arm. His war was over, but his testimony had just begun. He would insist other, more grievously wounded men be evacuated before him. He would treat his own wounds. He would crawl the final 300 yards to safety under his own power. His war on Hacksaw Ridge was finished. Now, let's jump the narrative forward. Not just a few days, but a few months, to October 12, 1945. The war is over. The world is trying to heal. In Washington, D.C., on the sun-drenched lawn of the White House, President Harry S. Truman stands before a small formation of soldiers. He picks up a light blue ribbon, from which hangs a 5-pointed star. It is the Medal of Honor. He turns to a thin, unassuming man leaning heavily on crutches, his arm in a sling. This is the moment the declassified file is opened for the world to see. It's the moment the system, which had once pushed back with such skepticism, is forced to officially and publicly acknowledge the truth. The citation is read aloud, a formal, almost sterile military document that attempts to capture lightning in a bottle. It speaks of outstanding gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty. It details the events of April 29th to May 21st. It mentions the ridge, the rope, the grenades. And it states, for the permanent, official record of the United States of America, the final, verified number 75. Imagine Captain Jack Glover, somewhere in the crowd or reading about it in a newspaper, the man who had tried to have this soldier court-martialed for refusing to carry a rifle. Imagine the Inspector General's officer, the one sent to investigate the anomalous reports, now reading the presidential citation that confirms every last, unbelievable detail. The official story had been rewritten. The heretical whisper from a muddy command post on Okinawa had become the law of the land, signed and sealed by the commander-in-chief. For Desmond Doss, this wasn't vindication in a fight against the army. He never saw it that way. The truth that was finally brought to light on that White House lawn wasn't just about what one man did. It was about why. The initial mystery, how could an unarmed man survive on Hacksaw Ridge, had been solved. But the declassified truth, the one found in Doss's own story, opened up a new, far deeper question. It wasn't about the absence of a weapon. It was about the presence of a faith so powerful it could bend the very laws of war. So now we arrive at the final revelation. The lifting of the fog. All the bizarre clues, the contradictions, the moments of impossible survival, they all snap into focus when you understand the one, beautiful, and terrifying idea that drove Desmond Doss. He wasn't operating on a military map. He was operating on a moral one. And on his map, there were no acceptable losses. Let's use a final War College briefing. Imagine a surgeon in a mass casualty event. The hospital is overwhelmed. The wounded are everywhere. The chief of surgery institutes a brutal triage protocol: treat the savable, comfort the dying, and move on. It is a system designed to maximize survival across the entire population. It is logical, efficient, and deeply painful. It is the very definition of command in a crisis. Now, imagine one medic in that hospital ignores the protocol. He doesn't move on. He goes to the patient designated as expectant, the one with no hope, and he stays. He holds a hand. He administers morphine. He works, against all odds, to save a life that the system has already written off. He is violating the logic of the hospital, but he is upholding a different, more absolute law. That was Desmond Doss on Hacksaw Ridge. The United States Army was the chief of surgery, and its triage of B Company was strategically sound. But Doss was the lone medic operating by a higher law. His actions weren't a critique of the Army's logic, they were a demonstration of a different logic altogether. This is the aha moment. The reason he survived the patient Nambu gunner wasn't luck, it was because his actions didn't register as a threat in the enemy's martial worldview. The reason he could use the chaos of a mortar barrage for cover was because he wasn't trying to gain ground or kill the enemy. His singular focus on saving lives allowed him a clarity of purpose that made him adaptable and fearless. The reason he went deeper into enemy territory wasn't because he was suicidal, it was because his map showed wounded men, not enemy positions. Every confusing piece of the puzzle, every action that seemed to defy military sense, is perfectly explained when you realize he wasn't playing the same game as everyone else. He was playing a much older one. When an old historian, a man not unlike myself, sat with him years later and asked him how he could possibly have done it, Doss didn't speak of courage or bravery. He gave a quiet, simple answer. I was just praying to the Lord. Please, Lord, help me get one more. And here are the echoes, the questions that linger in the quiet of the archive long after the documents are put away. The story of Hacksaw Ridge isn't just the story of a hero. It's a profound investigation into the nature of strength. The Army initially saw Doss's refusal to carry a weapon as a critical weakness. But on that ridge, it became his greatest strength. It was his lack of aggression that made him invisible to the enemy's logic. It was his singular focus on healing that gave him a courage that baffled professional soldiers. His story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question: what is true power in the crucible of war? Is it the ability to destroy, or is it the ability to save? Is it the courage to kill for your country, or the courage to die for your fellow man? Desmond Doss never fired a shot, yet he may have been the most effective soldier on that entire battlefield. He didn't fight the enemy. He fought the very premise of war itself, the idea that some lives are worth sacrificing for the sake of an objective on a map. The final, declassified truth of Hacksaw Ridge is that the fog of war is not just a product of missing intelligence or the chaos of combat. It is a fog of the soul, and sometimes the only way to see through it is with a light that doesn't come from a flash of gunfire, but from a belief in something greater than the battle itself.